Okay, so welcome everyone to our workshop on visualizing intersectionality, which will be given by Professor Carrie Wu from the Department of Sociology. And before I introduce Carrie and hand over the baton to him, I would like to make the land acknowledgement for York University. York University recognizes that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the university campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The university acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as the Karanto has been caretaken by the Ashnabek Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Palm Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Professor Carrie Wu is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at York University, who doesn't need much introduction for those of you who know him. His recent research on political culture, migration, and cities has appeared in peer-reviewed journals, including Daedalus, Journal of American Academy of Arts and Science, PNAS, Social Forces, Social Science Research, the Sociological Quarterly, Ethnic and Racial Studies, International Political Science Review, Urban Studies, and the Canadian Review of Sociology. Carrie believes strongly in the importance of sharing and disseminating his research findings, and indeed he has done this extensively. He's published opinion articles in the Washington Post, the Toronto Star, National Post, Maclean's, The Conversation, among many others. And he's also shared his research with the public via national and international TV, radio, and newspaper forums, and including what he's about to do now, which is give this particular workshop. So I would like to hand over our session today to Carrie Wu, who will carry us through the rest of today.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Very nice to see many familiar faces and also names. And today what I'm going to talk about is to visualize intersectionality. And when we think about data methods, we also often talk about data visualization, right? Recently, I've been thinking maybe all the theories that we can visualize the theory, right? Good theory need empirical support. And also like nowadays, when we on Twitter, Instagram, only thing we look at is pictures, graphs, right? Figures, right? And those is a new way of communicate with the public, with other people. Right? And then theory, we need to communicate social theories, sociological theories through those kind of ways too. Right? So that's the last 2 years I've been thinking, really trying to develop a project that really focusing on theoretical visualization. Instead of, okay, data visualization, yes, it's about data visualization, but really think about how to visualize theory so people better communicate with the public or people like with our parents, with our people outside of academia to think about what is social theories. Today, the focus is intersectionality, right? Even though we don't have much time to really think about what is intersectionality, but I would like to just do a little introduction about what is intersectionality. What is intersectionality, right? So one thing I often think, like years ago, like when we walk on the street, right, in American cities, in Canadian cities, one thing that struck me most is in the dating market. Think about how Asian women, Asian men, Black women, and Black men, and white women, white men, on the dating, holding hands, walking on the street. The pattern is very clear that you often see white man holding Asian women's hands. You often see Black man holding white women's hands, right? You rarely see that Asian man with white women or Black women with other racial groups, right? So that's like one way of really thinking about like how in the dating market, like race, gender, create unique positions or disadvantages, advantages in the dating market, right? So one thing you can see is in the US, this is data from the US, you see Black men are twice as likely as Black women to intermarry, right? And then and you can also look at the data for Asian men and Asian women, right? So you see race and gender really intersect or interact to shape lots of outcomes, right? This is just one example. So what do we mean by intersectionality? So I would say this is one kind of sentence definition. Those interconnected social categories overlapping, right? Create overlapping kind of a system or norms or structural hierarchies to produce all those type of inequality, right? So for today, I'm talking about intersectionality, and one big question I'm gonna ask for today is a very simple question. It just use this question as an example, right? How race and gender intersect to create educational or income outcomes inequalities, right? So for example, can think about race and gender and who in Canada or in the US, think about which group will be most disadvantaged in terms of, for example, educational opportunities or earning incomes, right? So this is just a very simple question. And then what I'm gonna do, we were gonna use the GSS data to really explore and try to answer this question, right? You might have answers if you know the literature well, or you research about gender, race, and education, income inequality, you probably already know the answer, but let's go through the data and try to visualize how those variables that create disadvantages and advantages for some group than for other groups. So it's very short introduction for the theory. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share my RStudio. How many of you already installed the R program? So because we need R Studio to work through those questions, right? So if you have not yet installed, we can maybe just quickly to show you how we can very quickly install the RStudio. We can just search. Can you see my screen? So R project, right? And then we will download it's just Google R project, and then to download right here, and then you can pick anyone. Let's pick Canada, for example. And then if you having Windows system, you just download R for Windows, install R for the first time. If you installing R for the first time, then you will just download and then install like very similar like installing like apps. And then when we have this installed, we will also search RStudio, right? Because we will work through those codes through RStudio. So then you just download RStudio right here. Download RStudio for the desktop. And then you can also just search RStudio. You will install R first and then install RStudio. Okay. So that's just like very quick. Hopefully many of you already have those installed. I want to know how many of you have not installed the RStudio. I just want to give a, if you have RStudio, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we can wait like 5 minutes, so so you can install. Okay, I think most people have. That's great. Okay, then we can continue. So in this morning, Sue helped send out the data, right? Because you can also download data through the GSS website, but the data is huge. So loading will take some time. So I just select a few variables and then I send the data to you. So please download the data and then save it somewhere on your laptop. What we're gonna do is, first thing I want to also talk about how to create a all markdown. Yesterday, this morning, Sue sent out the all markdown, right? But for teaching purpose now, we can also together to create a all markdown file. So you will go, when you have RStudio, you will go top left, new file, and then you see new file, and you see markdown file right here, right? So for example, you can say this is today's talk, and then you want to generate for PDF or Word. So then you say okay, then this will become a markdown file, right? So I already load up all the codes, and if you have not yet received the file, I will send out again later on. So we can go through the codes here together. So then, and then you can also have some notes I wrote down that you can already go through later when after this workshop, if you have more questions. So first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna input the data. We're gonna use the GSS data. To input the data, we have two ways. One way is very simple. You just go here, input data set, right? So input data set right here. And then because the data file I shared this morning is from Stata, so you can just from Stata and then browse. And then for example, if you, depends where you save your data. So for example, my data is from data, and then this data, and then you just say import. Then you will be able to have the data, for example, input. So the data is in my RStudio. We have 68,846 observations, and then we have 8 variables. Okay. Another way to input the data is through writing the codes, right? So to write the codes, first thing, if you have not yet installed the package we call Heaven package, right? So you can just remove this pound sign and install Heaven package, and you can run this. So okay, let me show you how to, when you have all markdown, when you want to write codes, you can through here add a code, right? Add the all code, right? And then you can simply type the code, install packages, Heaven packages, and then you can just, I already install. So if you have not yet, you can just install packages right here. When we install packages, then you can also just write input the data through this code. So you will install packages and then your library Heaven, and then you input the data right there like this way, right? So you just say, okay, I want to input, you can name whatever you want to name it, but for today, just name it GSS equals read the data, and this is the path where you save your data. You can also, if you don't know where you save your data, and then you just go to the file, and then you can copy paste that pathway, right? Or you can input the data, move the data where you download data to your working directory. right? And then to figure out what is your working directory of your RStudio, you can just get working directory, and then you can run this code. Then you see, okay, this is, for example, this is my working directory. Okay, any questions of importing the data set? I will wait a minute so everyone are able to input the data set. Any questions about importing the data set? Are you able to input the data into the RStudio? Okay. So you will see when you have data, you will see, right? So I'm also going to run this code. I'm also going to run this code. So I have another GSS data, right? Because I just changed the name to GSS, and then this is the data set that is in RStudio. When we have the data set, you can take a look at the data set, right? So for example, you add another code, and you can have names, GSS. You run this code, you see all those names, variable names in the data. Like I said, we only have 8 variables, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? And another code to just, first thing I want to talk about is just when we have the data in the RStudio, we want to have an overview of the data structure, right? So one code that is very useful is hat. So if you write hat and the data name, so hat GSS, the data name, it will give us the first 6 observations. The data is organized in observation is, for each row is a observation. Each column is one variable, right? So we have 8 columns because we have 8 variables. And then we have 68,846 observations, meaning that we will have more than 6,000 rows, right? So the data is rows and columns. Columns, the variable, rows is each observation. So when we use hat, we will be able to know the first 6 observations. We can also use another code, the tear, to look at the last 6 observations, right? If you want, will be produce very similar, like this kind of table. And then if, for example, we want to look into very specific variable, for example, I want to look into the degree, education measured in degree, we can also use the hat. And then what we're going to do is just hat GSS, the data set name, $, and then degree, right? So when we run this code, it will give us the observations too, right? 6, so 3, 0, 1, 3, 1, 1 is the first 6 observation for this particular variable. We can also create a simple, for example, pie, just to visualize the distribution of education in degree, right? So because degree can be a categorical variable, right? So we can just use a table, pie the table, and this particular variable. So if we do this, you will see we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 as the degree in, and we will be able to know how, if we want to know how this is coded, we can look at, see if we have code here. I think it's messed up the data a little bit, but I want to show you the code for degree, how it coded. It doesn't have the label. I think something wrong with the data. It should show up the label. Let's try another variable's gender, see if we will do hat GSS data and then gender variable, sex variable, and see if we see, because we still don't see. I think something wrong with the data. It should give us the label name. Another way, if the hat does not work, you can just say GSS gender. So this will give us everything, right? So all the observations and then how it coded. So male coded 1, female coded 2, right? So that's another way of looking into the data, right? So into each variable. First, we can look at the overall of the data. Second, we can look into each variable and how each variable is coded. In this case, male coded 1, female coded 2, right? And we can also create a bar plot to visualize the gender distribution. To create a bar plot, is simply just type in bar plot, because gender or sex is a categorical variable. So we always want to do a table to turn it into a tabulation. So then it will become a bar plot, right? So if we don't do that, the R Studio will recognize this as a numeric, right? And it is very difficult to visualize numeric when we only have 2 categories, right? But education in years, so for example, education in years is a different story, right? So for example, if we want to look at education, so this is education measured in years, right? So for this is coded in years, from 0 years in school, 2 years in school, 20 years in school, right? So one way to visualize this, instead of, we can of course do a bar plot or pie and then treat it as a categorical variable. But if we do that, it will give us a lot of bars, right? So for example, it will give us still, we only have 20 categories, so still it's okay, but it's a numerical variable, a continuous variable if we think about the data, right? We will talk a little bit more on education variable later on. But this just gives us some idea about how to look into each variable. I want to ask any questions about looking into each variable. Are you able to, for example, create a bar plot for gender or degree education variable? Try to create, right? So for example, let's do this. Try to run a code and then try to do a tie to a variable, right? So then a categorical variable can be table and for example, GSS in this case, and we also have trust variable. So trust is measured in a categorical form. So we can do this pi, and then we want to tabulate the trust as a categorical variable. Excuse me. So we know that categorical variable trust is measured in 1, 2, and 3, right? And you can also just take a look at how trust is measured. Then you can run this code, and then you see trust is measured in 1, 2, 3, and then 1 it can trust. 2 means can't be too careful, meaning that you can't trust in other people. And then 3, I think it depends. 3 it means depends. So that's how trust is coded in the data. And that's how we look at a categorical, right? Categorical variable. So that's like 2 things we have talked so far. One is just to look into the data structure, right? Especially in this case, we have small data set that we can just double click. We'll know, see, this is how the data is organized. All the rows are the observations, and each column is a variable, right? So that's most data, survey data especially, are organized in this way, right? And then we can use hat or other way, even just view, right? So if you do view GSS, it will open up the data, right? It will open up the data. So you can have a look at how many variables we have and how many observations we have and how each variable is coded, right? You can also look at, for example, dimension, right? So dimension, the data dimension, if you do dimension GSS, it will give us, for example, the dimension first is rows, how many rows we have. And second is how many columns we have, the dimension of the data. Rows, or the columns, right? And data is organized in that way. So for example, another way to think about this is, for example, I want to look at the data, but I only want the first rows and then first column, right? So this is rows, this is column. So if we run this, it will give this 1972. And this is the first row, first column. So if you look into the data, it's this number. 9072 is the first row and first column. So you see the data is organized. We can also do the second row and third column, right? So if you run this, it will be 0. So then we go back to the data, the second row and third column is right, this one. That's the 0. That's the 0 we are looking at. So that's how data in general is, the dimension, rows. It's very important to understand data is organized, especially most data in the data frame in RStudio or in other program is organized in this way. It's row observations and variables, rows and columns. And then if we want to look each variable specifically, we would just use the data set name and then $, and then, for example, race variable. So this will give us the specific about this particular variable, right? This data set $, and then race. So this is how race is coded. 1, 2, 3. 1 is white, 2 is black, 3 is other, right? So that's how we think about data, how to look at the data structure, and then also how to look into each variable specifically. So this is the first part. Second part, I also want to talk a little bit about how to label variable, right? So for example, especially at the beginning, we don't have. So if we use hat, right? If we look at hat, the data, we do not know what one means, right? How to label this. So one thing we can do, we can label those values. We can label variable values. And to do that, a very useful package is called XPath, EXPSS. So you can install these packages. If you can remove this, just install packages EXPSS. That's the packages we will use to label values. Another way to install packages, if you don't want to write codes, you can also just do here. You see the packages and then install right here. And then you will just type EXPSS. So for me, I already installed, so you will find those here. If you not yet installed these packages, you can just type in and then install. So that's another way of install the packages. All those packages that you can install through two ways: write codes, or if you don't write codes, you can do it here. So I already installed, so I'm not going to run this. And after we install, we just library. Library is that, okay, we install the packages. We just need to take those packages out to use, right? So let's run this. The packages is already here. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how to label variable names as well as value names, right? So I'm going to create a new data in case I messed up the original data. So it's always a good idea to create a copy of the original data in case that we messed up the data. So to do that, you can just right? So you can I turn it to GSS1 equals to GSS. So when I run this code, you'll see another data set is exactly the same as this one because I'm just copy this, right? I create a new data set, but the new data set is the same with the GSS data, right? So just oftentimes it's good idea to create a copy. So in case we messed up, we can always go back, but we can always reload the data, right? We can always go back to the top to reload the data so that you have the new data each time, or the original copy. To label we label two things. One is the variable names, right? So for example, in this, we have variable names: year, education, degree, sex, race, right? We can label, turn it into, for example, year of the survey, right? So that's like label variable names. In data, oftentimes we have very short label for data. It's just easier to store the data. And second is the variable is the value, right? So for example, for sex, we have 1 and then 2. 1 and then 2. So 1 is male, 2 means female. So what if we want to label this? Label 1 as male, 2 as female, instead of just 1 and then 2, right? So that's the idea of labeling. It's very powerful when we creating visualizations, because when it's properly labeled, when it's labeled properly, then the visualization will look better, right? So for example, to label this, we can just use the code apply labels, and then apply labels GSS data, and the year. So the two things, year equals year of the survey. So this is the way to label the variable names, okay? And then degree, for example, degree is education in degree, right? So label degree, education in degree. This is label the variable name. We can also label the value names, right? So degree is, if we look at degree, is measured in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So we can have a look at the degree, how degree is. Or we can just create a pi to better able to look at the degree. We already did. Table GS. Right, so it's 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 0 means less than high school. 1 means high school, right? So we can relabel this using this degree equals C combined less than high school, because this is text, so you always need to use quotation, equals to 0. So we label 0 as less than high school as 1, and then junior college 2, bachelor's 3, graduate 4, right? So we can label the variable names as well as the value names, right? So I'm going to just run this code all at once. Now I'm going to create a pie, exactly the same pie, right? For example, let's just copy this code and then we run it here. And then we are using GSS1 data, right? For example, we did GSS, a new copy of the data, table GSS1, degree, and then we will see now it's labeled less than high school, the junior college, graduate, right? So you see it's labeled now, the data. So that you can people can better understand what the pie is about, right? So that's label. So labeling the data. Okay, let's move on. So now let's get into the question, right? So what we want to do for today is really looking at how gender and race intersect to affect education and income outcomes, right? So first thing we can look at is, yes, there's education. We can create a education overview, but the first question let's get into is there a gender differences in education, right? So let's look at bivariate between gender and education first, and then we add more variables. So first thing we can look at is there gender differences in education, right? So first thing we can do is we'll take a look at the education variable. You can do a summary of the education, right? In years, that's education in years. This is when we do a summary, it will give us the minimum like Q1, Q2, which is medium, and then the mean Q3, and then Q4, and then also the missing data, right? And then when we do a table, it will give us the frequency distribution, right? Frequency distribution. We can also turn it into a bar or a histogram, right? To create a histogram, just to histogram the data set name and the variable name, right? So when we have a continuous variable, we can always use a histogram to look at the education distribution. So this is how in the United States, how education is distributed, right? Majority people have like high school here, and then many also have like more than high school, and 20 years is graduate level, right? So you see, this is in general distribution of education in years in the United States. So this is one we call univariate analysis, right? We only look at one variable. What is the central tendency in terms of median and mean? What is the range, like how spread of this particular variable, right? So that's mostly what we care about when we describe a variable is two things. One is central tendency, right? What will be the mean, median, like in the middle. And second is the variability, how spread the distribution of this particular variable, right? So that's we often call the univariate analysis. We focus on one variable. So to answer the question, is there gender differences in education? Then we will have to get into bivariate analysis, right? To look at men and women, how they differ in terms of level of education. So next, we're going to visualize the gender differences. And then for today, we will use the ggplot to do all the visualization, right? ggplot is a very, very powerful package to visualize like univariate or bivariate and multivariate relationship, right? So ggplot. So to install ggplot, you can just install ggplot packages. You can just write install packages and ggplot2, or a better way is just install whole the tidyverse packages. Install packages tidyverse, because ggplot is part of it, integrate into this packages, right? And then there's much more function of the tidyverse. So I would suggest to install tidyverse instead of just install ggplot. So go ahead, install this tidyverse. You can also install tidyverse right here, right? What you can do is just type the tidyverse right here and then install, right? So two ways you can write the codes, install packages, or you can do right here, just type in the package name to install the packages. So I already installed, so I will give a note that already installed. So don't run this code. After we install this packages, we can just library. Library is a function that just taking it out for us to use, right? So I'm gonna run this code. Okay, now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create ggplot. The language of ggplot is ggplot, and then data. So first is what kind of data you're gonna use. So in this case, we'll use GSS data, and then how you're gonna map graph, right? So you can type, you don't have to, but you can just type mapping equals AES. You should define what is the X and what is Y, right? So for example, for now, I just want to do a univariate analysis, education, right? So when we run this, nothing gonna happen because we did not define what graph you want. So we will add, for example, we want to graph a histogram, GEOM histogram. So try to understand the language of ggplot, right? So ggplot, you define what kind of data we're gonna use, and then to define the variable AES, right? So for example, I just want one variable, and I want to look at histogram. So that we can run this, and it will create a histogram. Education typo. This will create a histogram. Something wrong with this. Let me see. ggplot to data. Okay, let's define X equals this. Oh, not sure why it's not working. Okay, I think something wrong with the data I input right here. So let's change to GSS, the other data set. I just copy, and you see we define X equals education, and we want a histogram, right? And this is give us the histogram. Or we can also change to, so you can define what kind of mapping you want, right? We can change some other, like we can do bar plot. We can do bar, and when we run this, will give us a bar plot, right? We can also, for example, box plot. We can do a box plot and will give us a box plot of the education, right? And this is, and then we can, this is X. We can, when we do box plot, we also want the horizontal, then we will just define Y equals education. So we want a Y equals education instead of X equals to education. Then this will give another box plot that is easier to read, right? So this is box plot. So we can, essentially, we can create different types of univariate distribution of the education variable. Right? It looks like, so from the bar plot, it looks like overall the education, most people. So this is box plot. So you see the IQR in the middle is about 11 years to 15 years of education. Majority of Americans, the most middle, 50% of Americans are having more than 11 years in school education to 15 years in school education. This is just an overall of the distribution of education variable, right? So we move on next. We want to look at, is there a gender gap, right? And to do that, we just need to add another variable, right? So we would define X as gender or sex, Y as education, and then we want a box plot, right? So we can run this. So exactly the same code, ggplot, the data name, or you can just, you don't need to define data because you just say data is GSS, and then I want to define X factor is that we want to sync sex, gender as a categorical variable, right? So separate between male and female. And then Y is the outcome as an education in years, right? So when we run this, it will give us something wrong with the data. So now we're going to just do GSS1, see it works. GSS1 works, right? So we treat sex as between male, female, and this is NA, right? So that's missing data for the gender variable, and then education, right? So we can also remove, right? So if we look at the sex, we have this NA, so we can remove the NA, right? So when you visualize, we don't want this NA to be part of this education difference, gender differences, right? To remove NA, the code is we want a GSS data or GSS1 data, and then we talk about the dimension of data is that the first is the rows, the second is columns, right? So we talk about, okay, for example, we want the first row, first column. So now what we want to do is we want to rows, the observations is no NA, right? We want to remove NA. So to do that is just that no, this is no, is if it's NA, GSS1. So this code, means we want to drop whenever the rows for gender variable is NA. Right, so try to understand this code. We want to drop if the row for the gender variable is NA, we want to drop all the rows. So that's the meaning of this code, right? So now what we're going to do is we want the data, and then with the same data set, let's put it GSS1, and then we want to drop this as NA, and then we keep other variables, right? So, and then we repeat this code, and when we run this code, you see NA is drop now, right? So this is one way, a very easy way to drop the missing data, right? If it is NA, we want to drop it for this gender variable, and then we can recreate the code exactly the same. So we don't have this NA column in the visualization, right? And then when we look at this, we do see some gender differences, right? It looks like women tend to have a little lower education, right? So there is a gender gap in terms of the box plot, right? This gender differences in education. Okay, so now we have the idea that there is gender gap in education. I also want to show you another way of moving the NA is you can also just say NA omit and then the data set, right? So NA omit the data set, and we will do this. We also do not have an NA, but you see the differences between this one, this code, and this code, right? Why? Why you see a differences between this code? This code, you see women tend to have lower education. In this, you don't see much differences, right? So why we produce two different graphs? So the reason is we only remove gender that is missing data, right? In this case, NA omit for the whole data set. We remove all those cases that contain missing data for all the variables, right? So you need to be careful about this code and then this code. And this code is, I want to remove missing data for sex only in this case. This code is that I want to remove all the missing data in all the 8 variables. I remove NA omit all those data sets that contain missing values. We call this like we omit all those variables that contain. When we look at this, there's no missing data for all the variables, right? But when we only do this, there's no missing data for this particular variable, right? So you need to be careful in terms of cleaning your data, how you're gonna deal with the missing data. 2 ways of dealing with the missing data. We can also use another way of visualizing the gender differences, right? Using this code, for example, we still delete the NA, but I want to look at education, but I want to use this code to separate between gender. The GSS data is just something wrong with this. So this is another way to look at the gender differences in education, right? So instead of here, you define X as gender, Y is education. You use Y is education, yes, but you use this code to say I want to separate education by gender, right? Essentially, it's the same thing. It's just different ways of visualizing the gender gap, right? So try to understand some of those codes, right? So when you go home, you can try to practice. For now, we don't really have time to really focus on each code specifically. And this is another way to look at, so let's run this code too. They do the same job, it's just different code. Right, so this is, you see, very similar visualization. And then we do see gender differences. Okay, so that's the first question. Is there gender differences? Yes, it looks like women, females tend to have lower education. Okay, so next questions. Is the gender differences vary across racial groups? Right, so now instead of gender and the level of education, we have another variable, which is race, right? Gender, race, and education, right? So that's try to visualize how gender, race interact to shape education outcome, right? We still use the ggplot, and then we still remove, we are not just removing gender, but we are also removing missing data on race, right? So that's how this code works. So using the same data set, and then we are removing this code is just, okay, I want to drop missing data on gender and the missing data on race. And then I want to gender and then education, the gender gap. So this is give us the gender gap in education. And this is give us the racial differences in this gender gap, right? We look at gender gap, but I also want to look at how this gender gap vary across racial groups, right? So that's how we understand this code. So let's try to run this. And this is, so see, we have within each racial group, we have gender gap, right? We have three racial groups, white, black, and other. And then within each racial group, we also have gender differences, right? Man and women, male, female, male, female, male, female. And then we do see some interaction, right? So for example, among within white groups, we see female have lower level of education, right? But among blacks, the differences is especially the median, right? So this is box plot. And then this line is the median for the education levels, right? If we just look at the median, you see among white, females have a lower median than white males, right? But among blacks, we do not see the differences in median education between black males and the black females, right? And in other racial groups, we also see relatively, compared to white groups, relatively differences is almost, we can't really see the differences, right? So that's something that the gender gap in education is vary across racial groups, right? So we can also calculate the mean, right? So what, for example, I'm just gonna calculate the mean. Calculate the mean for this is just a code that calculate the gender, race in education levels, right? So you see white, black, and other, and we want a mean, right? So, and then we remove all the missing data. So you see for white males, the average education, the mean education is 13.27. For white female is 13, right? So there's a 0.2728 differences. But for black, this black females have a little higher mean in education than black males, right? So for black females is 0.27 higher, a little bit higher than black males. And then for other groups, we also see there's not much differences, but still males tend to have higher, right? So in this sense, the only black males is disadvantage in this case, right? So black males has lowest level of education, right? Even though blacks in overall have a lower education, but black males have lowest level of education. But in other racial groups, you see males tend to have higher education than females. But among blacks, males have lower levels of education than females, right? So that's the differences. That means that yes, the gender differences do vary across racial groups. Black males have the lowest level of education relatively. Right? We can also calculate the median instead of the mean, right? It will give similar. So for the median, for example, right? We saw for white, we have white males as 1 year advantage relative to females. But in terms of median, we don't see gender differences for the blacks and other groups, right? So that's in general how gender and then race, how gender and race interact to shape education outcomes, right? So now we have some idea about, like, yes, gender and then race can interact to shape education outcomes. Next, what I'm going to talk about is how to run a regression to better able to know how gender and education, gender and race interact, right? So to do that, so before we go into the education, any questions into regression, any questions so far? Any questions that, right? So we learned this gender gap in education. So that's the first thing we established. The second is the gender differences in education vary across racial groups, right? Among white groups, males tend to have education advantage relative to females. But among blacks, females have education advantage relative to males, right? So if we think about, this is the data about the US, right? So when we think about United States, right? Think about the race, black men, their experience, right? Their educational experience differ, how their educational experience differ from white men or Asian men, for example, right? So I'm not sure whether people have written about black men have the lowest education, or only within blacks, female has education advantage relative to males. In other racial groups, we do not see the female advantage, right? Of course, the data we are looking at is over years. It's been like from 1972 to today, it's 2021. But today, if you look at this recent years data, probably we will have different outcome. Today, across racial groups, probably females tend to have education advantage. How much time I have, Sylvia?
We had advertised up until 2, but I think it's up until you're done with the workshop.
So I will just run a few regression to really visualize how gender and education intersect. Okay, let's go back to the RStudio. Right, so let's do simple regressions, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna run a regression called fit1, and then we will use OLS regression, right? Linear methods and education as an outcome, gender and then race, and the data is GSS1. And then when we run this, and then we can summarize the model. Right, so this is the model, like how gender and then race and how gender and race intersect to affect education outcomes. To include, there's 2 ways of running an interaction in regression. One is education as sex times race, right? So this times race will give us the interaction effect term, right? Another way is we will include both sex and race, and then we will include this term, right? So you can see right here. So this will give us exactly the same results, right? So when we run this code, this will give us exactly the same results, right? I also want to quickly to show you how we can better visualize the regression. So this is messy, right? So this is messy, not very nice table. So we can use packages, Stargazer as a package that produce tables, better looking tables, right? So you just install this packages and library. I'm going to run this, and then we run this too. So it just Stargazer, the first model and second model, right? We run this model and then another model, and then just Stargazer fit one and fit two, and then we do this. This will give us a nicer, better looking table in terms of how gender and then race affect education outcomes, right? So you see we have gender, there's gender differences, very significant, because 2 is female. So we say female tend to have lower education, right? Negative. And race, we treat it as a continuous variable, 1, 2, 3. So lower race means minority groups, relative white, right? So then the minority groups tend to have lower, right? And then this is race and gender is positive. This means the gap is greater among minority groups. The gender gap in education is greater among minority groups, in this case, relative. So those are regression models. Next, we want to visualize this interaction, right? So regression is already a great way to look at how gender and race interact, and is significant. So we know this significant interaction effect, right? So to visualize, there's 2 packages we need to install. One is just interaction packages, another is JTools, right? So you will install these 2 packages, and then we will run this packages. And then in this case, we do interact plot, and then the model, the prediction is based on gender, and then the moderation, interaction moderation effect, because we ask the question, does gender gap in education varies across racial groups? Meaning that how race moderate the gender gap, right? So that's the idea, and then we can take a look at this. So we are treating race as a continuous variable. So the mean is the middle, this 1 standard deviation away from the mean. So this, you can understand this is white, and this is other, and then mean, you can think about mean is, in this case, is black, right? So this, you see, this interaction effect. The racial differences between the gender differences in education varies across racial groups, right? So this, we treat it as continuous variable, but it's better to treat both gender and the race as a factor variable, a categorical, right? So what we're gonna do, we're gonna generate a new variable, sex2 and race2, as factor variables. And then we will run this model again. And then we can compare these 2 models. So instead of treating sex, gender, usually we do not treat gender and sex as continuous variable because they are categorical variables, right? So now we turn it into categorical. So you can see female have lower education, right? So it's significant. Female overall have this lower negative impact on education. and then black have lower, other racial have lower, but the interaction effect, you can see female black have higher relative female, this is female, and then black have education advantage relative to male black, right? So that this is the key interaction effect we are trying to look at, right? So now, how do we visualize this? How do we visualize this female education advantage relative black male, female blacks relative to male blacks, right? So to do that, because it's categorical variable, we will use this code, categorical cat plot. And then the model we are fitting is this model, right? Is fit 3, and then gender, race, or we can also change to race and gender, right? So when we run this, will give us 2 visualizations. One is between, if we just look at between male and then female, right? So you see, this is for female groups, this is for male groups, and this color is the race variable, right? So among female, white have higher education than other and then black. Among male, we also see white have higher education than other than black, right? So the overall is white always have more levels, higher levels of education than other and then white, no matter which gender groups, right? So this is one way of looking at how race affect education between genders is consistent, right? Between gender group, the race effect is consistent, right? White have more education than other and then male. But if we look at the gender differences, we can also see, for example, for white, the female is lower, and for other, female is also a little lower, but only among black, female is higher, right? So only among blacks, we see female is higher, right? And then we can also change it to another way of looking at it, right? So this is by race, but between genders. We do see for white, black, and other, for white, males have higher education. For other, males have higher, even though it's not significant. But for blacks, we see males have lower education than females, right? And then overall, you see black males have the lowest level of education in the United States, right? So that in general is, this is give us a great idea how we can look at how gender and race intersect to shape education outcomes. So there are a lot of other codes like we won't be able to go through. Hopefully for now you have some basic understanding about how to visualize gender and race intersect to shape education outcomes. In other codes, there are a lot of other, like we can also do three-way interaction, how gender, race, and the class to shape education outcomes, and how gender and race intersect to shape education outcomes over the time, right? So the all markdown file I share have all those codes, right? So hopefully you will go back and then go through all those codes and then try to see if you can also replicate all those codes. So for today, that's all. We don't have much time, and then it's quite slow. Yeah, so I will end here. Any questions? Maybe like let's do 5-10 minutes questions before you go home and then try to go through those codes on your own. No questions. Okay. it's very difficult to teach online using those codes. It's better to teach in person. I thought it's going to be in person, but it's really difficult to go through those codes online. (2:30), shall we go through more? Or it's almost there, right? But yeah, 10 more minutes. Yeah, maybe, yeah. Yeah, I think it's the codes I share that go through those codes maybe will help. And if not working, reach out and maybe we can meet one-on-one to go through those codes. If you are really interested in doing some interaction or intersect how gender, race, class, those intersect to shape outcomes. Thank you everyone for coming today.
And thank you so much, Carrie, for the workshop and doing it over Zoom. I also want to thank Lisa, who became a TA and, you know, on the sidelines in a way by helping other people sort of sort out some of the questions while Carrie was still speaking. So thank you so much, everyone. So if there are any other last minute questions, we can take them now. Otherwise, I think we are at the end of our workshop today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, bye.